Welcome to Chapter 4, where we're going to talk about the globalization of sport. In the book, it calls it the cowboyization of sport. We'll break that down in one of these other videos. But let's first start with a general understanding of, or an introduction to this term globalization. First of all, as we've talked about throughout this class so far, is that sport is global. It's universally understood. In other words, people can be on the same soccer pitch and be able to play a game and have similar language as well as how they interact with one another, even if they don't speak the same language. And so we see that there is a universality, if that's a word, of globalization of sport. We also see that sport is a microcosm of society. In other words, the things that happen in society we also see in sport and vice versa. And the same is true for global trade. We see goods and services that are traded across borders in sports as an example of the global economy. And so, for example, baseballs for the World Baseball Classic may be produced in Japan, yet you have players, so that's a good, yet you have players that are coming from Cuba or Brazil or the United States, but they're playing in Spain. And so you see this intermingling of different cultures as well as economic systems across borders. There's also could be both positive and negative aspects of globalizing sport. For example, one of the positives could be opportunities for new business. By having the ability to trade across borders, you have the ability to learn more about other cultures and their economies and how to become more profitable. However, there are some negatives. So, for example, one of the negatives would be adding another element of strife between nations. If there is a negative aspect. So having more business trade between countries can be both positive and negative. And so what we're going to talk about here for the next few videos is what you see on the screen, starting with globalization in this video, moving on to cowboyization, and finally the factors that drive sport, cowboyization of sport, nationalism, and then trends. And so let's talk a little bit about globalization. To start off, first of all, it is defined in your book. It's defined as the process through which an increasingly free flow of ideas, people, goods, services, and capital leads to integration of economies and society. And so I'd say the key here, key to this definition, is the integration of economies and societies. And so, as well as the free flow of these things. And so we depend on each other for a lot of things, and globalization helps with that. Every country that is an isolationist country throughout history has been at a disadvantage from an economic standpoint. And part of the reason we depend on one another is that nations cannot exist on their own. So I say this isolationism, a country such as, let's say, North Korea, which does have trade but is limited in their trade with other countries, has some disadvantages, as opposed to other nations that are freely trading ideas, people, goods, and services. They have the ability to expand in their infrastructure as well as technology, and therefore become more profitable as a nation and growing economies. And one of the reasons why, or two of the reasons why we see that we depend on one another through globalization is this idea of capitalism and consumerism. Capitalism and consumerism. We're going to talk about each one of these in a second on the next slide, but they are the driving force behind economic globalization. Again, capitalism and consumerism is the driving force behind economic globalization. And so what is capitalism and consumerism? We'll start first with capitalism. You can see that capitalism is oftentimes, it's defined in this way. It accelerates the quest for more profit by implementing creative strategies within the organization. So capitalism can at times be seen as negative in nature, especially when it starts to harm the culture in which capitalism is striving. In other words, we care more about profit than people and culture and doing the right thing. The other aspect is consumerism. And so consumerism is the greater accessibility to a variety of goods and services. And we know that this leads consumers to seek for the best price. And so consumerism gives us more availability, more options, and therefore leads us as consumers to find the best price. And so we have to understand as marketers two important topics when it comes to consumerism. Because they're always looking for the best price, as a marketer we have to be sure that we understand two things. willingness to pay, and price sensitivity. And so rhetorically, willingness to pay, asking the question, what is it? Rhetorically, the answer is willingness to pay is the maximum amount a consumer will pay for a good. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most they want to pay or are able to pay. That they're able to pay, but it is something that they're willing to pay or that they want to pay. And so, good example of understanding willingness to pay is what we call a Dutch auction. A Dutch auction is what you typically see in like an eBay system where you're bidding, and it's not just found in Holland, by the way. But you see that prices give us a good indication of the value of that product and how much a consumer is willing to pay. As they start to bid up, you can kind of tell what their willingness to pay is. The other term, again, the other thing that marketers have to understand when it comes to consumerism is their price sensitivity. Price sensitivity is essentially a measure of whether or not a consumer is sensitive to price changes. So higher prices is something that is, when we're talking about as we raise prices, it affects our sensitivity. So somebody who is high in price sensitivity, or they respond readily to prices, say that they're only going to buy the product, that good or that service, when there's the best deal. And so if there's a high price and somebody has a high sensitivity to price changes, they'll be less likely to buy it. But somebody who is price insensitive, somebody who doesn't respond to changes in price, will likely not always seek the best deal, but the one that is most convenient. Most college students traditionally are price sensitive in nature. They're always looking for the best deal. That's why you can probably tell me every night of the week where the best fast food deal is in town. Buy one, get one's free, the 50% off, those types of things. And so why does this matter to us as marketers? This capitalism and this consumerism, because both of them impact consumers' purchase decisions. And in each culture, this idea of capitalism, consumerism, is met with different ideas. Some countries and cultures are more willing to accept consumerism. That's one thing why sport and sports sponsorship has grown in the United States, is because consumers are willing to have consumerism invade the sport landscape. They're okay with seeing sponsors ads everywhere. Other cultures are not, and it affects that. Okay. And so if we look at globalization, there's basically some negative aspects of globalization. And I see here, there's two basic pictures I have on the screen. Both of them have to do with the World Cup and the Olympic Games that were held in Brazil. The first negative, and I'm going to use those as an example. The first negative aspect of globalization is globalization encourages an uneven distribution of wealth in a lot of cases. And so with an increase in desire for profit, firms are also trying to keep more of it, that is profit, and are less likely to hand out to employees, but also consumers are not likely to spend the money. And so this is particularly a problem in societies that have a lower SES citizens. In other words, those that don't have the ability to pay for the high-priced items or those things that come from globalization. And so if the citizens are not able to pay for the good or service, then that company will likely ship it to another country. And so example is South Africa in the World Cup and Brazil in the World Cup. So much money was spent on sports facilities. And if you look back now, even in Brazil, those facilities are going useless. Nobody's using them. They're being torn down, and the only reason they were built was for the games. Yet other things were starting to be hurt because of that. And so welfare systems in the countries and those types of things. It also, so the first thing is it creates an uneven distribution of wealth. And the second is it creates a pseudoculture of corporate interest. It creates a pseudoculture of corporate interest. What that means is essentially the culture in and of itself is no longer focused on the things that matter to that culture, but more importantly, they're focused on the corporate interest or the companies that bring in wealth to countries to pay for labor. And so consumers are less likely to be loyal to a nation and more likely to be loyal to a brand. And so think about baseball as an example. In the United States, do you think that we'll ever see sport in the United States turn into what we see in Japan in the Nippon League, where teams are named after companies and not the towns in which they're in? Are we going to see the Houston Exxon or Houston Mobile baseball team, or looking at the Texas Albertsons or Kroger, whatever you want to call it? Do you think this will ever happen in our own country, and is this even a problem? All of these things are what we're talking about, this creating a pseudo-culture of corporate interest. If we're more concerned about corporate interest as a society than we are our own culture, then we have this false, or also known as pseudo-interest, for these corporate owners or corporations. And so when we talk about globalization, global sporting events, oftentimes we have to look at two things: how have changed how people participate and how they spectate. For example, if you look at the history, and we've talked about the World Cup, one of the biggest problems the original World Cup had was because of the inability for Europe to, or not inability, but lack of European teams in the first World Cup. We had issue because a lot of it had to do with transportation technology, so the ability to move people from one place to another. That has changed over time. Global sporting events have helped us to, in the infrastructures of countries where you hold these mega sporting events, it helps out the infrastructure of those cities. It also changed how people spectate, so this is new media, social media, and those types of things. Okay? And so what I want you to do in this next, as your assignment, basically you're going to do a Dropbox assignment. In the book it says, sports such as soccer can bridge differences and overturn prejudice in the world. For example, you've seen things in soccer such as say no to racism, and these things, especially through soccer, have been seen as arguably effective versus ineffective in their marketing campaign. And so what I want you to answer in your Dropbox assignment is this question. Is this, the say no to racism, an appropriate place for this message? Is soccer an appropriate place for say no to racism? Why or why not? And then the second question is, why should sports marketers care about social issues globally? Answer that and move on to the next video.